Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to talk a little bit about our third set of AP technical vocabulary, and this is about argumentation and specifically logical fallacies. Now, as we've been talking about in class, an argument is not just when you're yelling back and forth at someone. It's a process of reasoned inquiry, which is a coherent movement from a claim to a conclusion, usually based on evidence. And a claim is an assertion or proposition. Basically, it's what you're saying you believe to be true about a particular topic. It's your main idea that you're trying to support. Now, a claim is different from just the subject. A subject could be something like ice cream. Ice cream is a topic. And you could talk about the history of ice cream, the different flavors of ice cream, where you can buy the best ice cream. But when you switch and say something like, ice cream eaten too fast will give you a headache, now you're making a claim. This can be debated, it can be argued, it can be proved or disproved. Claims can be claims of fact, policy, or claims of value. So depending on what part you want to argue for your audience, you'll find the different claims are formed about a topic. Now, a warrant is an assumption that's shared by the speaker and the audience. So something that you agree that the audience probably agrees with also. And this is usually some kind of a shared value that's either stated or implied. One of my favorite examples of this is the Michelin tire ad that always shows this baby riding in a tires with the tagline, "Because so much is riding on your tires." That's assuming that everybody loves and values our children and that we want to protect them. If you don't have this shared value of wanting to protect children, then you're not going to believe this claim that Michelin is the tire that will keep your family safe. When you form your arguments, you can form them with a closed or an open thesis. Now, a closed thesis is when the main idea lists out the arguments and the major points that you intend to make. So it's kind of already a done deal and sort of previews what the subtopics will be. An open statement, on the other hand, just makes the claim and allows that you're going to be giving the subtopics and the argument a little bit later on in the piece. So, for example, the Harry Potter series are exciting to read because of the three-dimensional characters, the exciting plot, and the complex themes. That's a closed thesis. You've already said what your three main points are going to be. But an open statement is going to say something like, the popularity of the Harry Potter series demonstrates that children's literature can include complex themes. And this doesn't explain that you're going to be in there talking about the three-dimensional characters, about the exciting plot lines. It leaves it open that you can go ahead and prove it later on in your piece. Deduction is the logical process of reaching a conclusion by starting with a general principle and then applying it to the specific. In other words, the larger idea helps to prove the specific. And sometimes this is expressed in what's called a syllogism, which is a little logical puzzle, logic structure. So if you start off with the first premise that exercise contributes to better health, and then if you also accept that yoga is a type of exercise, then you have to come to the deduction that yoga contributes to better health. So you go from that general broad concept of exercising to a more specific form of exercising in yoga. Now, when you're talking about evidence, there's two main ways that you can prove your points using evidence. There's either quantitative, these are things that you can actually count or measure because it's quantitative, so you count the quantity. This might be things that are statistics, surveys, polls, votes. And then there's qualitative. These are qualities that you may have noticed, and this is often evidence that's based on observations or descriptions, and the qualitative evidence sometimes implies an impression or opinion. So, for example, if I asked you to describe the new freshman class, okay, there are qualitative ways you could describe them. How many kids are in the class? What's their average age? Which schools did they attend before? What's the ratio of males to females? Those are all things that can be counted and measured. And then there's qualitative. You might say, well, they seem really friendly, or they seem to be very good looking, or they seem to be very disciplined, or they're being very successful as students. And those would be things that are more hard to measure and count, but are more qualities that have been observed. Now, we've practiced and talked a little bit about rebuttals and concessions. Rebuttals gives voices to the possible objections, and it's often a direct address of an opposing argument. So you tell the person directly what you're saying is wrong, and here's why I think why I think so. So you might say something like, AP classes are not hard, but they do require hard work. And then a concession acknowledges that there's another viewpoint. You might set up and accept that part of the other side of the opponent's arguments is true, but then sets it up so that you can explain why you don't have to accept the whole premise or why other parts of it are false. So you say something like, although AP classes can indeed involve a lot of hard work, notice that that's the concession, that AP classes involve work. You say, but the work pays off in the extra skills a student can build. So you set it up and you say, okay, I agree with this part, but then you turn it and say it's actually a good thing and goes towards my side of the argument. Now, in the next couple slides, we're going to go over some logical fallacies. Now, logical fallacies can actually be sort of entertaining. They're a weakness in an opponent's argument. It seems to be something that sounds like it should be right, but there's a failure to make that logical connection between the claim and the evidence that's used to support it. Some kind of a flaw in the reasoning. Now, in the logical fallacy that we call ad hominem, which is a Latin term which means to the man, you actually argue something about an opponent's character rather than about the opponent's ideas. So it's switching the argument from the issue to what you think about the other person, and basically a personal attack. We should not listen to Mr. Wonderful's request to appropriate money for a new park because he was arrested for drunk driving 6 years ago. So you attack the character by saying that he's a drunk driver, but maybe this idea about appropriating money for a new park is really a good idea. So ad hominem is when you're attacking the person instead of the ideas. Another type of logical fallacy is known as ad populum, or is more commonly called bandwagon. And it literally means in Latin, to the people. And this is a fallacy that claims that just because a lot of people are thinking or doing something, that it must be a good thing to do. If you remember, for years, McDonald's had these signs that would say how many billions of people had been served. Notice it doesn't say anything about how nutritious or how delicious or what a good value McDonald's food is. It just says, hey, lots of other people eat here. You should eat here too. So, for example, the sentence, you should vote to elect Adara Patel. She has a strong lead in the polls. It doesn't tell you anything about the candidate. And so the logic is that just because other people are also saying that they want to vote for this person, that you should too. Sometimes a logical fallacy will have an appeal to false ethos, that is, an attempt to appeal to false authority. Somebody who really has no experience on an issue is cited, and it's a little bit similar to prestige identification, which is a propaganda technique that we're going to talk about in about a week or so. And it helps make the audience think that certain products will endow them with the same characteristics of the celebrity who endorsed the product. And a famous example might be, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV, and I use Tylenol for all my headaches. So even though the person isn't actually a doctor, the presence of the white coat and the stethoscope lends you to think that somehow they should be accepted as an authority on medical issues. Begging the question is a logical fallacy where the entire argument is based on an initial claim which may or may not actually be true to begin with. So the whole argument becomes in question. It's called begging the question. So if you look at the example, my rules, I am always right. Number 2, just in case I'm wrong, see number 1. So, that's assuming that number 1 has to be correct. So a lot of begging the question is going to be this idea that you've kind of gotten into almost a circular reasoning where you offer the claim itself as evidence. If you give access to information online, they will develop strong critical thinking skills. What's the connection there? That's a logical fallacy. Now, circular reasoning, which I just mentioned in the last slide, is related to this idea of begging the question. And this is a fallacy in which a claim is repeated as evidence itself. You can't give me a C, I'm an A student. Or if you look at the picture over here, the napkin religion is the one true religion because it says so right here on this napkin. So again, that idea that everything, the claim just refers back to itself and doesn't offer any additional outside evidence. Dichotomy means to cut something in two. You see the word di from two and then otomy. You ever had something like an appendectomy where they're cutting out your appendix means to cut? And this is a logical fallacy where you're presented with two different options, and one of them is usually extreme. And the idea is to force you to agree with the first proposition because the second one seems so impossible to accept, even though there may actually be some middle way in this particular argument. So either we agree to higher taxes or our grandchildren will be mired in debt. Maybe there's a way to have a compromise on the taxes that won't necessarily leave you in debt. That's not necessarily a cause and effect type of condition. Or if you look over here, there are only two types of people in the world, those who think in false dichotomies and penguins. I'm pretty sure there's probably something in the middle on that. So watch out for false dichotomies. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is Latin for after which, therefore, because of which I know seems kind of weird. But basically you're trying to say that if something wrong, it's wrong to say that something's the cause of an event just because it happened first. So you can't say that just because something happened later, it was the cause of the first one. Another way that we say this is correlation does not equal causation. So just because two things happened at the same time or happened one after the other doesn't mean that one caused the other. If Joey's fridge broke after Rachel moved in, it doesn't follow that Rachel caused the appliance to break. A slippery slope argument goes that if you allow A to happen, then B will happen, and then all the way down to Z, and assumes that Z is a really bad thing. Therefore, A should never be allowed to happen. It's a type of argument that goes to extreme hypotheticals and tries to connect things that may or may not have any connections to them. And you'll see this in arguments like, if we allow people of the same sex to get married, soon people will want to marry their dogs or their cars. Or if you've ever seen that series of direct TV ads that always begin with a series of things that if you do them wrong, it always ends with something like, don't get body slammed by a lowland gorilla. You know, if you do this, then this will happen. And that's an amusing way to make that point. But the idea of slippery slope is that it kind of jumps immediately to this extreme hypothetical without necessarily showing how the very first part is going to be directly connected or cause this hypothetical bad result. So keep your eyes out everywhere. Television, media, politics, advertising. False reasoning is around you all the time. And what you want to do is learn to recognize it and, of course, avoid using it yourself. And that's the end of this set of vocabulary.